Hello and welcome to part 3 of Historical Correctness for Glory. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos, I'll have the link to the playlist on the top right corner so you can be caught up. If you have, then we'll just jump right into it. Shaw and the 54th finally got their wish to take part in the plan to invade Charleston. With Shaw becoming friendly with a young general named George Crockett Strong, the 54th were ordered to move to the west side of Folly Island, and there were placed under the command of General Alfred Terry. The plan that General Gilmore proposed was to weaken the defenses surrounding the port city to open it up for invasion. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard led the defenses in the area, and he knew that it wasn't just the force that had been keeping the attackers at bay. The land was covered in marshes and creeks, along with some dangerous animals like snakes crawling all over the place. The first place that Gilmore focused on was Battery Wagner on Morris Island, located on the south side at the mouth of the harbor. The plan to take control was to have General Terry leading 4,000 men, including the 54th, to create a disturbance on James Island in the north. By doing so, Gilmore hoped that Beauregard would take some soldiers from Wagner and send them to the island to deal with it, thereby weakening its defenses. He also planned on shelling the battery with warships and from their own batteries on Folly Island. On July 10th, General Terry and his men moved up north on Stono River and landed near Holland Island Creek 3 miles up. For the next few days, they advanced across the island and managed to successfully picket a land bridge called Grimball's Causeway. And it was here that the 54th experienced their first military engagement. In the hopes of chasing the Federal troops off of James Island, General Beauregard, as Gilmore wanted, sent more troops away from Wagner and Morris Island. Then, on the dawn of the 16th, Confederate troops began their attack. According to this account in Thunder at the Gates, Peter Vogelsang, the eldest soldier in the regiment, held his position behind a palmetto tree as 100 rebels surrounded him. As he retreated, he managed to get off a shot and hit one of them. Then, with his bayonet, he sliced out 3 more before hitting his 5th with his rifle in the stomach and stabbing with the same sharp weapon, and making off with the dead man's gun. As James Island was largely covered in swamps and creeks, Vogelsang managed to escape as he waddled across with a nicked heel from a bullet, but some of his fellow soldiers weren't so lucky. 2 corporals, Harvey Davis and Anthony Schneek, were shot just behind him and died as they drowned. 2 others, surrendering to the Confederates, which Vogelsang saw as a big mistake, were quickly executed. However, Vogelsang didn't get far as he was shot through the chest and the bullet exited from his back, just barely missing his spine, but collapsing his left lung. Trying to crawl to safety, he quickly passed out. Later in the afternoon, the 54th regrouped and began to engage with the enemy, in which the film portrays. With 800 Confederates heading towards them, the 54th unleashed their musket fire. When the rebels got within 900 yards of our line of battle, the right wing of General Terry's brigade gave them 3 volleys, which checked their advance. They then made a stand with their artillery and began shelling us, but it had no effect on our forces, as the rebels fired too high. For the next 2 hours, the 54th managed to stand their ground and eventually chased back the Confederates. Casualties were low, with 14 killed and 20 wounded. All in all, it was an excellent first impression for the 54th. However, according to the film, the nation may not get to know their bravery because of one little thing that happened outside of some obscure town in Pennsylvania.
You haven't heard? Lee was turned back in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. Now Grant's taking Vicksburg, and all on the 4th of July.
My God. Oh, splendid, just splendid.
Any casualties?
42.
Oh, give me the details, I'll wire it in. I don't think we got a prayer making the paper. I'll talk to you later in your tent.
Okay, I have to call bullshit on that. Okay, if you know your Civil War history, that happened on July 4th, 12 days ago. And the operation began on the 9th, 5 days after that battle. You mean to tell me that Shaw and his men, much less the entire nation, did not hear anything about the most famous battle in American history for nearly 2 weeks? Yeah, news may have traveled pretty slow back then comparatively to today, but they do have the telegram. And just to be assured, the 54th did get plenty of credit for their actions and bravery on James Island from their fellow white soldiers. For the first time, we had met the enemy and had proven there, fully to our satisfaction at least, that the Negro soldier was a fighting soldier. And you can't believe that the black newspapers from all across the nation were all over it, praising both the men and their commanding officer. So it wasn't like they were completely ignored as the film suggests. And if it had been just that, they would be pretty satisfied with it. But even so, things would not change the minds of some people fast enough, if at all. Just a few days prior, a massive riot over the new draft law occurred in New York City as mobs of working-class Democrats and Irish immigrants attacked any federal property and buildings, destroying anything that reminded them of the Republican Party. Then, their next target, African Americans. In what is probably one of the most disgusting displays of racism in our history, they ransacked and burned down an orphan's home for colored children as 233 frightened kids escaped with their lives. Thankfully, the number of casualties was remarkably low with 11, although that was hardly a small comfort for one of the soldiers of the 54th, as one of the unfortunate victims was his 7-year-old nephew. Regardless, the 54th has proved their worth to their fellow white soldiers, but their shining moment was upon them sooner than they expected. Despite not having completed walls on all sides, hence the definition as a battery as opposed to a fort, Wagner was still formidable when it came to capturing it. Sitting on the narrow end of a peninsula of Morris Island, it was 250 yards wide and 100 yards deep, big enough to house 1,700 men, led by General William Taliaferro. Built of packed sand and earth and fortified by palmetto logs, Wagner's pitched front was crowned with serpent stakes, while a canal designed to fill at high tide provided a water battery for attackers in their siege works. 14 cannons faced the Atlantic, protecting the harbor, while 6 guns aimed at the beach, keeping any chance of an invasion low. Even as General Gilmore has the battery continuously bombarded for days, the men in the battery could easily retreat into their capacious bomb-proof apartments. Even with delays to their attacks thanks to uncooperative weather, they are very confident that they can and will overcome Wagner. Meanwhile, while Shaw and his men were still weary after yesterday's fight on James Island, Shaw was still determined to have his men play any sort of role in the fight, even though he felt that he may not survive it. While in the film he volunteered his regiment to lead the charge into Wagner, it was Gilmore, who was also just as impressed with the 54th's conduct on James Island, who placed him in the front. Despite, of course, of one of the generals on his staff remarking, "Well, I guess we will let Strong lead and put those damn from Massachusetts in the advance. We may as well get rid of them one time as another." Classy. Oh, hold up. This may be a bit too late to bring up, but I figure I might as well get this out of the way while it was nagging my brain. Okay, this guy right here, played by Bob Gunton. That is General Charles Garrison Harker. In the film, he is portrayed as the commanding officer of the Department of the South that Shaw and the 54th were placed under, and as someone who had profited off from the many raids under his watch. The reason why I never brought him up is because the real General Harker had nothing to do with the 54th. In fact, the real Harker was a complete 180 of the Harker in the movie. Instead of an older man who was corrupt and used the war as a way to plunder and become rich doing so and order his subordinates to do the same, he was roughly the same age as Shaw himself, and it was seen as a brave and exemplary officer who was highly respected by his men and senior officers, having fought in some of the war's famous battles like Shiloh and Chickamauga. And just like Shaw, he would die on the battlefield just a year later at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in Georgia during Sherman's march against Atlanta. I know that was a bit of an off-pace tangent, but I felt that I need to give this man his due. Okay, back to Wagner. Because of natural barriers, the charge had to be carried out in 2 columns, with the 54th being in the lead, and they will be followed by the 6th Connecticut and the 48th New York. However, the 54th were still exhausted and had nothing to eat ever since their fight on James Island, but Gilmore was determined to set his plan into motion on July the 18th. With just 650 men from the 54th, they set up ranks on the beach. There, Shaw handed a bundle of his unsent letters for his family to journalist Edward Pierce. People at the beach noted how Shaw had dressed quite exuberantly. His close-fitting officer's jacket was set off by the polished eagles on each of his shoulders, and a fine narrow silk sash was wound round his waist. An expensive officer's sword from an English manufacturer hung from his belt. and on one hand showing an antique gem set in a ring. His gold watch, like his sword that was etched with his initials, was tied in place by a gold chain. Finally, in case that his body needed to be identified, he kept his pocketbook inside of his clothing. To one of his subordinate officers, Shaw appeared, quote, somewhat paled, and he was grinding the cigar clenched between his teeth, unquote. It wasn't only Shaw who was nervous about the upcoming engagement. Lacking their usual lightheartedness, a couple of men shifted nervously as balls split above them in the air. Of course, even a significant moment could be broken with some unintentional comedy, like when one of the white officers nearly shot his own foot while they waited. Before the advance was given, Shaw, as observed by Gooding from the ranks, spoke softly with his men, which was unlike their commanding officer, yet notice how nervous he was. His lips were compressed, and now and then there was a visible slight twitching in the corners of the mouth, like one bent on accomplishing or dying. At 7:45 p.m., the advance onto Battery Wagner began. With the low tide, not only were they given plenty of room to maneuver on the beach, but the battery's moat would be shallow. Even so, the Confederates, crawling out from their shelters, manned their guns and began their defense, firing their weapons at the approaching 54th. As the climax of the film, it does a superb job of building up the tension with the 54th charging at Wagner that lasts into the night, and once it does, it's a sight to behold. However, keep in mind that the 54th weren't the only ones that fought in this battle. 2 other white regiments fought alongside them, but I understand why the filmmakers wanted to cut them out, as they want to keep the focus on the black soldiers. However, at the same time, I feel that this was another missed opportunity because, after all of the mistreatment that the 54th has suffered up to this point, it would be quite fitting to have both white and black soldiers fight alongside one another, as it would be the ultimate image of what America stands for. But that's just a thought. But as valiant as they were, in the end, they couldn't take the fort. There were plenty of reasons why this failed and possibly was ill-conceived. The most obvious was that they were heavily outnumbered. Those underground compartments that the Confederates hid during the heavy bombardment were surprisingly effective, and it hardly damaged the battery, if at all. Second, Gilmore held back 3 regiments as reserve during the initial assault, and, having saw that things weren't going so well, decided to hold them back, denying what many in the 54th believed was a possible victory. In the end, it was a complete military disaster. Of the 650 men who went in, 272 did not return. That includes 23 white officers, in which Shaw was among them, having been shot several times as he ascended the wall in the attempt to rally his men. And yet in the end, it ends up winning a much more important victory. One month later, President Abraham Lincoln, impressed by the bravery of the 54th, called for at least 100,000 black soldiers. By the time the war will be over, 180,000 answered the call. And yet there are still some skeptics who still scoff at the continuing use of black troops, believing it had a hampering effect on the war. Lincoln has something to say about that. You say that you will not fight to free Negroes. Some of them seem willing to fight for you, but no matter. Fight you then, exclusively to save the Union. I issued the proclamation on purpose to aid you in saving the Union. Whenever you shall have conquered all resistance to the Union, if I shall urge you to continue fighting, it will be an apt time then for you to declare you will not fight to free Negroes. I thought that in your struggle for the Union, to whatever extent the Negroes should cease helping the enemy, to that extent it weakened the enemy in his resistance to you. Do you think differently? I thought that whatever Negroes can be got to do as soldiers leaves just as much less for white soldiers to do in saving the Union. Does it appear otherwise to you? But Negroes, like other people, act upon motives. Why should they do anything for us if we would do nothing for them? If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom. And the promise being made must be kept. Peace does not appear too distant as it did. I hope that it will come soon, and come to stay, and so come as to be worth the keeping in all future times. It will then have been proved that, among free men, there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet, and that they who take such appeal are sure to lose their case and pay the cost. And then there will be some black men who can remember that, with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind on to this great consummation. While I fear there will be some white ones unable to forget that, with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. After Wagner, blacks have taken part in nearly every engagement and campaign with the exception of the Atlanta campaign. By the end of the war, 25 African Americans will be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. That includes Sergeant William Harvey Carney of the 54th, in which his citation reads, "Grasped the flag, led the way to the parapet, and planted the colors thereon. When the troops fell back, he brought off the flag, under fierce fire in which he was twice severely wounded." As stated, Colonel Robert Gould was killed at Wagner, and, as intended to be an insult to his honor, was buried with his men on the beach in a mass grave as opposed to a military funeral fit for an officer. However, his family, instead of having his body located and returned home, decided that his final resting place should be with his men who fought and died alongside him. So, in the end, does the film still hold up? Despite all the newfound criticism I made in regards to the historical inaccuracy I discovered in the research of the story, I still highly recommend this film. As a movie, this is about as entertaining as it can get, with a well-balanced story populated with a cast of memorable characters as well as some spectacular battle sequences. This was made during a time where hardly anybody, except for a few Civil War historians, even knew that black soldiers existed during the war and had played a major role in its outcome. Now over a century of being written out of the history books for several generations, as well as many unsavory portrayals that have dominated the medium, they've been finally given their due. As such, the film finally put the focus on where it should have been, that the Civil War was a test on the nation's resolve on the notion of freedom and equality regardless of race or skin color. So as a film that introduces the history of black troops in the war, I think this serves as a good starting point, and there are plenty of books on the subject if you're willing to check them out, as I've used them for this video. I got them listed in the description box if you haven't noticed it. And now this marks the end of Historical Correctness of Glory. And thank God for that! But in the end, I'm glad I never gave up on it. It had its trying moments, but I actually had fun doing it, and now I actually have a couple ideas I'd like to try in the future. But I need a break, so it's gonna be a couple of weeks before my next batch of videos comes out. With that being said, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed it. You have yourself a great day and I hope to see you soon.